Okay, so good evening and welcome to our second installment in the Reconsidering conversation series. I'm here with Dr. Gregory B. Sadler and Abdou Gaye, and tonight's topic is Charlie Hebdo. I am your off-screen moderator, Andi Sciacca, and just wanted to give a few words about sort of the context of tonight's talk. And I will start with some questions that Abdou had asked us to consider in terms of Charlie Hebdo. So, Abdou writes, remembering Charlie Hebdo is a conversation with our community and a way to bring to the American audience the spirit of Charlie Hebdo. To question what is satire, what are the limits, what role does it play in a civilized society, and to what extent are we obliged to try to understand the feelings and motivations of those who wish to harm. Je suis Charlie, where do you stand? Are there good guys and bad guys, and is this how you see the world? Furthermore, what can our governments do about this, and what can you and I do about it? So Abdou will be taking us through those topics. Greg's prepared material, about which we'll have a conversation, has to do with the notion of taking offense and the marketplace of ideas, and we'll look at a couple of different thinkers, and then have a good conversation for about 45 minutes. Questions are encouraged throughout. And we will just sort of have a free range of ideas during this discussion rather than more formal prepared speeches, as I understand. So, yeah. Greg, you're starting?
I am.
Perfect. Yes. Okay.
So, what I've got here is about maybe 15 minutes worth of stuff, and some of it ties in with these passages about freedom of speech and the marketplace of ideas that I copied for you. The Charlie Hebdo massacre, and then this whole plethora of responses and debates that have been going on since it happened about how we ought to make sense of these matters, they bring home in a particularly strong way some of the tensions that are always there when it comes to matters of free speech and censorship and offense. And you know, these are murky and messy topics. They're not things that are easy to stake out any sort of position that's going to be, you know, across the board, always correct about. So there's going to be a lot of debate about it. It's, you know, in a certain way, it's of the essence of free speech to have debates. It's fitting that there would be a debate about free speech and the marketplace of ideas. We shouldn't try to just throw our hands up and say, well, we can't come to any sort of determinations. You know, it's too big, too vast for us. There's just a whole bunch of gray areas or any evasions like that, I think. But we also have to be somewhat careful in our reactions to it. So what I'm going to do for myself, you know, coming at it as a philosopher and as a historian of ideas, I want to do two main things. One is sort of a historian as a historian of ideas. I want to go through some of these key ideas and thinkers and passages about free speech, but also about this idea of the marketplace of ideas that has really structured the way in which we think about free speech and whether free speech is a good thing or not. And then I want to try to introduce a few distinctions or clarifications or at least just considerations that might be helpful in thinking about and discussing these matters. So that's more of the philosophy part. If we think about the idea of freedom of speech, it's a very old idea. Socrates exemplifies it in many respects in ancient Greece. He calls himself a gadfly, and he goes around and he philosophizes pretty much anywhere he wants to. He goes to the marketplace, and if he finds people there that he wants to talk to, he talks to them. If they don't want to talk with him, they leave. They go somewhere else. He goes to people's houses and gets into arguments at their houses, sometimes even with the person who's hosting the party. He gets invited to a lot of places. He philosophizes even in the law courts when he gets hauled into court for his trial, where he's going to lose and then get, you know, sentenced to death as a result. And he tells people, and this is in Athens, where what was called parrhesia, or we often translate that as freedom of speech, the ability to say what you want, was highly valued. He's being put on trial in the place where you're supposed to be able to say anything that you want for the things that he said. and ultimately found guilty by a jury of his peers, and he has to execute the judgment himself by drinking hemlock, and dies. But he becomes sort of a patron saint, you might say, not only of free speech, not only of parrhesia, but of speech that matters. So, what characteristics does Socrates have? Well, no place or person is off limits to discussion or debate. He is not a respecter of persons, to use the sort of biblical term. He engages in examination of ideas, beliefs, even ways of life through questioning and through comparison, through presentation of alternatives. And he really makes a lot of people uncomfortable because of that, because they come to see that their way of life may not be entirely well thought out. There may be some problems with it. He also views what he's doing as for the good. He talks about calling his fellow citizens back to the care of the self, the care for what really matters. And so it's for the good, whether they realize it or not, of those involved who might actually take offense in the process, many of whom, in fact, do. Now, this idea of parrhesia continues throughout ancient culture and even into medieval culture. We often think of medieval times as being just this age of monolithic faith. All you got to do is read some stories of monks to find out that no, they were pretty frank and honest with each other and said what was on their mind quite often. And that was just the monks, not the nobles or the poets or people like that. But this notion of being able to speak one's mind, to present one's position, and then to have other people argue with it or debate it, it's been around for a long time. And here in America, we often just sort of assume that's a good thing. But, in many cases, it's not. It's not, just sort of automatically or unquestionably a good thing. So people give reasons why it would be a good thing. And this is where we start to get to something like the marketplace of ideas. So John Milton writes this tract when in Britain they're requiring that there be something like censorship of published materials. Censorship not so much in the sense of, like cutting out portions, but you have to get it approved. And this is an unapproved tract, this Areopagitica that he's writing. And he says this passage in there. He says, "Though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field. We do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her in falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." So this is the beginnings of this marketplace idea. But here it's not a marketplace. Here it's more like a boxing match or a wrestling match. Truth and falsehood are going to go toe-to-toe with each other. And the idea is truth will win out.
Except he's assuming there is a truth.
Yes, and we're going to be operating with that assumption, because that's a pretty common assumption throughout this. Milton was not a relativist. Most people aren't really when you scratch the surface. But when we go on with this, Voltaire and all these other Enlightenment figures like Diderot and D'Alembert in France, even before that Pierre Bayle, they're espousing something like that as well. And Voltaire gets quoted a lot because of Charlie Hebdo. Ironically, not something that Voltaire actually said, but something that his biographer, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, attributes to him. This: "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend it to your death the right to say it."
To your death.
Yeah. No, I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Sorry, did I misspeak there? Yeah, I'll defend to your death. Now, that is not yet the marketplace either. But it's still saying, look, we should have a variety of viewpoints. I don't have to agree with all of them. We can have a pluralism. When we get to John Stuart Mill, we're still not yet getting the word marketplace, but now we're getting something that's a very robust case-making, we can say, for why it's good to have a variety of viewpoints out there. And he gives you 4 different reasons. He says, first, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for aught we can certainly know, be true. So that's one problem right there. We might be shutting somebody up who actually has the truth. Secondly, though the silenced opinion be an error, it may and very, very commonly does contain a portion of the truth. And since the general or prevailing opinion is rarely or never the whole truth, it's only by the collision of averse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. So again, there's this idea that it's better for everybody if we have this, this clash of doctrines, this clash of ideas. Then he goes, third, even if the received opinion be not only true but the whole truth, which is rarely the case, unless it's suffered to be and actually is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will, by most of those who receive it, be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. And we see this, when we're trying to teach students, they often want to know what's the right answer, and we want them to know why the right answer is the right answer, to be able to give some sort of account for it, to be able to defend it, to be able to look at alternative possibilities. And so Mill is saying you can't do that if you don't have a multiplicity of viewpoints. And then he goes on and he says, fourthly, the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled, the dogma becoming a mere formal profession, inefficacious for good but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction. Sometimes truths can get in the way of new truths. And so, Mill is a huge believer in progress and, sort of the common good versus order for its own sake or authority for its own sake. And so he's kind of a representative of that point of view. Now, the idea of the marketplace of ideas, or the notion of that, comes about because of court cases. It's not coming about because of Voltaire or Mill. It's coming out of Oliver Wendell Holmes and William Douglas. So Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is always pretty acerbic in what he writes, notice what he starts out with. Persecution for the expression of opinions seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises or your power and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe, even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas. The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. So laying it out and letting people actually decide, having to make your case. And that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. And then a little bit later, that's in 1919, a little bit later, Douglas in 1953 writes, like the publishers of newspapers, magazines, or books, this publisher bids for the minds of men in the marketplace of ideas. So now we finally have the phrase, the catchphrase. But that idea has been building this entire time. This notion that we are best served by having a plurality of viewpoints that can clash with each other and will clash with each other. Now that leads to a few issues, and these come to a head, particularly with Charlie Hebdo, this satirical magazine, which goes about deliberately trying to, to stick it to people, to offend. And I think that there's four things that we could look at, sets of points that might be useful to consider. One is this sort of either-or situation that we're placed into that we don't have to be in. Another is the relationship between offense and harm. Another is thinking about responsibility for giving offense and for taking offense. And then the fourth thing is how we can use free speech in the marketplace of ideas as a response to other free speech. So the first one, when the Charlie Hebdo massacre took place, there was a lot of immediate reaction, including the people writing Je suis Charlie and putting memes up and all that sort of stuff. And then there was also a sort of a counter reaction of people saying, look, I'm not Charlie. As a matter of fact, what these guys were doing, we're not going to excuse the violence against them, but what they were doing was pretty offensive, pretty deliberately offensive. And maybe they were imprudent, or this is not the right thing to do. A lot of people seem to think that in the case of the Charlie Hebdo incident, if we say that what Charlie Hebdo did was in any way wrong, then somehow we're excusing the gunman. And that's simply not the case. We can actually, in any given dispute, it's possible for both parties to be wrong. And it's possible for both parties to be wrong to different extents. Could be that what the gunman did is totally inexcusable. What Charlie Hebdo does and did is, not particularly good and maybe bad in some respects. One of the things we want to remind ourselves of is that it's possible for an action to actually be right in one respect and wrong in another respect. There's all sorts of cases like this. And I think that this is something that's been left out of much of the discussion and debate about the Charlie Hebdo. Another thing with offense and harm, if we have a marketplace of ideas, we often talk like a marketplace is this pure neutral ground, and buyers and sellers just come in, and it's like we think about like going to the expo and there's booths, and I don't like this guy's stuff, so I'll go get this guy's stuff. But it's really much more antagonistic than that. All you got to do is look at an internet comment stream on any given opinion site, and you'll see the marketplace of ideas in its all its splendor, right? Including the argument that the other person is Hitler, which only takes certain. There's actually like a law, not a real law, but sort of a made-up law about how long it will take for any given argument to devolve into somebody calling the other person a Nazi. And it happens so often that somebody said there's a regularity to this. Now, we should then think about the marketplace of ideas and two things that go along with it. One is offense, and the other is harm. And some people it seems like they want to conflate the two things. They want to say anytime that offense takes place, harm has taken place. I think that that's probably a mistake. If we have a concept of harm, we can say something should regulate the marketplace, namely something like what John Stuart Mill called the harm principle. You can do what you like unless you're actually harming somebody else. So if I, spread libelous rumors about Abdou, I'm not just offending him or offending other people who like Abdou, I'm actually harming him. I'm tangibly harming his interests. He can take me to court and make a case. That's a pretty clear issue there. How should we understand offending then? Is offending harming the other person? Well, there's a couple cases in which we might say that offense does rise to the level of harm. If it's carried out in a bullying way, it can have sometimes very profound psychological effects. We know that in the case of cyberbullying with teens who are particularly vulnerable to this sort of thing, it sometimes leads to them committing suicide. It's clear that some sort of harm has taken place in that case. If we're concerned about the marketplace of ideas and people being able to express their points of view, if enough people, make fun of them or denigrate them, perhaps they opt out. They quit participating in the marketplace. And that's not only bad for them, but it's also bad for the rest of us if we value a marketplace of ideas. Another way in which offending another person could be taken as harm is if other people take that as a cue to that it's fair, it's open season on them. They're fair game. We get to attack this group of people. We get to suggest that they're in some way less than human, or uncivilized, or not to be part of our society. Now, a lot of speech in the marketplace of ideas is going to involve making claims that other people are fundamentally wrong, that they've got it, really screwed up. And there's various ways to do this, and I'd like to, just mention three, and these are quite different from each other. One would be measured rational discourse. Unfortunately, very rare, right? But this is one way. If I think that Abdou is wrong about some of his basic principles, I can try to make a case about that to him in a way that if he's a rational person, he should be able to at least see some merits to. Another is like outright insults. That's at the other extreme. You're a terrible person. I just make up some bad stuff about you or anybody else, and I try to get everyone else to come in on that. And we might think that satire is, where does satire fit in? It's certainly not on the level of sort of reasoned, proportionate discourse. Does it go as far as outright attacks? I'm not sure. I think it really depends very much on the case that we're looking at. Political speech is another example. When we get into political speech, very often the lines have already been drawn and people aren't really listening to each other. They're just sort of putting their side forward and trying to shout louder than the other people, trying to score some points. It's somewhere in the middle. So what we want to do when we're thinking about the marketplace of ideas is realize that there's a lot of different ways that we can be using speech, and some of them are going to give offense. Some of them are going to cause offense. The question we have to ask is that leading to harm? Now, the third thing I want to hit on is thinking about when offense actually occurs. Who's responsible for it? And I'd like you to think about sort of like a grid where you've got two possibilities for one person and two possibilities for the other person. We'll call them A and B. A is the person who could be giving offense. B is the person who could be taking offense. So person A can intend to give offense or not intend to give offense. Person B can take offense or not take offense. You see we have four possibilities there, right? It could be that person A intends to offend person B and person B takes offense. It could be that A intended to offend person B, but person B is really nice and they don't take offense. It could be that person A didn't intend to offend B, but B took offense anyway for one reason or another. And it could be that A didn't intend to offend B, and B didn't take offense. That's when everything is working out well, right? But unfortunately, in the clash of ideas, often not the case. Now, offense actually does exist in two of these four cases. And something is amiss to some degree in three, or perhaps just two of these cases. Maybe we want to say that if A intended to offend B, and B did get offended, maybe there's nothing amiss. Maybe that's exactly the way it's supposed to be, right? Now, we could add to this all sorts of other, twists. We could say, should A have known better? If they didn't intend to, but they ended up, offending B, maybe they should have known that the sort of thing they were going to say was going to be offensive. Or, we could say maybe B is being unreasonable. Maybe B takes offense way too easily over things that other people don't. Now, notice that when we're doing that, we no longer have the situation with just A and B. We're looking in from the outside and we're adding spectators or an audience or other people to it. That's part of what it means to be part of a marketplace of ideas, to be part of a community in which inquiry or at least argument is taking place. If we want to say that some people are being unreasonable in what they're being offended by, we ourselves need to bring forward some criteria. We have to enter into the marketplace in order to make those claims about them. Otherwise, perhaps we're being biased towards them. So this leads us then to the last thing, which is thinking about what's going on in the marketplace of ideas. When we don't like the uses that other people are making of their free speech within the marketplace of ideas, whatever they happen to define as free speech. I mean, we're at the point now where, because of Supreme Court cases, spending money is defined as free speech, which seems kind of a stretch. But in any case, when we're using our speech about other people's speech, it's equally a use of our own freedom to criticize or condemn other people's speech. So if I don't like what Charlie Hebdo is doing, I can acknowledge that they have a right to publish whatever they want, but I also have a right to say that's garbage, or that's hate speech, or whatever I want. It could be I could make up anything that could be like totally off base. Charlie Hebdo is doing what they do just because they're motivated by some vast conspiracy or something like that. That's a use of free speech on my part, right? And if you don't like my saying that, well, you can use your free speech to criticize or even to condemn me. You can even use your free speech to call for censorship or for action to be taken by the government against them, That's a use of free speech as well. That's also within the marketplace of ideas. Now, if I go to the point of saying, let's coordinate attacks on them, or we need to kill these people, My speech has passed over into something where it's a different kind of act than merely saying something. And that, now we're in the realm of harm. We're moving from offense to harm. The last thing that I want to point out is that maybe a sign of a good marketplace of ideas, as opposed to just a sort of a sham ideology of that, like what you see on a lot of college campuses where they have these free speech codes and you really can't say much of anything unless it happens to fit, the prevailing norms there, is that genuine moral disagreement can take place within a real marketplace of ideas. It doesn't have to be cleaned up, and it allows people to then have some sort of possibility of picking their point of view and of positions to make their case. I think that part of that is always going to include offending others. Until we're all on some sort of level of agreement with each other, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, we're inevitably going to offend by engaging in any sort of robust free speech. The question is whether we're offending more than we ought to, how we're framing things. Do we do it in sort of a cavalier manner just to stick it to people? And does anything, then, do we have any responsibility for the effects of that if we do that? So those are just some considerations. I don't actually have a lot of answers for these questions myself. It was something that the Charlie Hebdo thing just happens to bring home, I think, very well. So that's what I have to say about the matter.
Well, do you want to do a few comments and then
let's
go on? I have one question to lead us off.
Okay.
One of the things that I was thinking about is when we first scheduled this talk, the news about some of the fraternities that have recently been, sort of all over the social media and videos and everything that they're showing hadn't really broken yet.
Yeah.
And it's become a free speech argument, and including the photos now of the women that were being posted. I think it was at the University of Pennsylvania. They've kicked another fraternity off because of, violations of privacy and sexual ethics and conduct laws.
Oh.
But, I kept thinking the original frame of Socrates and this idea of parrhesia is not only freedom of speech, but also speech that matters.
Yeah.
And just this notion of sort of who and how we decide what matters. Because I've seen very hateful conversations about Kanye West's fashion, and I've seen very hateful conversations about issues of social justice. And so, people tend to devolve into the same kinds of attacks and offenses, regardless of whether or not we're really talking about marketplace of ideas level communication, or if it's just kind of that pandering to, the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's not yet a place to kind of position that idea of speech that matters without implying a certain level of implied censorship, right? Because there's certain things that we won't discuss simply because they don't matter, and yet they do cause great offense, and people argue freedom of speech over those types of things as well. And you don't want it to be reductivist, and you don't want it to be sort of like, well, then we can't decide anything. But I was struck by that. We've moved so far away from what I think Socrates would have intended in terms of our ability to have free and respectful argument as part of our culture or our state.
Yeah, it's going to, you're not going to have something where you can get everybody all to acknowledge, you might call it a hierarchy of values.
Yeah.
Right? I think that as educated, civilized, relatively well-behaved people, we would probably be willing to say that, political discussions about, the common good, where our society ought to go, are more important than fashion decisions, right? Or what music we should purchase or listen to. And there are some people who are they feel so strongly about that, they don't know anything about the politics to begin with, but they're very strong. They feel very strongly about whether you listen to this musician or this other very similar musician, and which one is better than the other. I think that we have to be willing to say some things are in fact more important than others, And the best that we can do is provide some sort of argument for why that's the case. Well, the political affects all of us, whereas what jeans you wear that more or less just affects you, buddy. And we're not going to convince everybody, but we can if we do say it, if we actually aren't afraid of not having an argument that can't convince everybody, we'll do a lot more good, and we'll actually assume our role as members of that space. With respect to the fraternity thing, I was only thinking about like the racist comment thing. The privacy stuff poses all sorts of other issues. My feelings about that are twofold. One is that if you enter into a place like a college campus where you know that engaging in say racism is not going to be acceptable, and then you decide to do it because your frat brothers are doing it, then you accept the consequences. Because you know exactly what you're getting into. I mean, we can talk about campuses being a little bit too politically correct and limiting too much speech on a lot of issues, but this is sort of like if you're going to go into a place where you're not allowed to say these words, and then you're going to say those words, you don't get to say afterwards, "Oh, freedom of speech. I don't incur any consequences," because you've entered into sort of a contract zone. So that's one thing. The other thing is there is too much political correctness on college campuses. We should have honest conversations about racism, but it doesn't strike me that the way to do it is by echoing racist chants. That's at that lowest common denominator. It's not contributing much to the marketplace of ideas. It's basically the equivalent of trolling on comments on websites. So yeah.
But maybe one of the problems is that it seems to me it's a little more difficult to have a discussion now. I mean, suppose I want to have a discussion with someone on Facebook and I put out something that I'm interested in, and with a friend, and we start dialoguing back and forth. But it's written there forever. I may say something pretty stupid, and then as time goes on, I change my mind. I alter my opinion. I see the light, and now forever I'm associated with something that I don't necessarily believe.
Yeah.
That's not. It's partly because everything is so out there, but it's also partly because there's such a sense of gotcha.
Yeah.
That it makes it difficult to feel safe to throw out an idea.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you're like me and you have a lot of conservative and a lot of liberal friends in Facebook, no matter what you do, you're gonna find somebody's buttons to push. Unless you're totally bland and just post kitty pictures and stuff like that.
It's not just Facebook. I mean, it can be with your with members of your family.
Yeah.
The discussion stops the minute there's a disagreement, as opposed to being willing to listen.
Yeah, we have a culture where people don't know how to deal with disagreement very well. How to actually view the other person as another person and not just an antagonist. What were you going to say, Judy?
I was going to say that it seems to me we went through many, many years of men and women making comments about women.
Yeah.
That were, just very denigrating, and women accepted it and fed it themselves to each other. The girdle jokes and all of those mother-in-law jokes and all of that kind of thing. And women believed those things and reacted to them as if, there's truth in them and so forth. So, and that's the same thing, I think, of course, with racism. So, when you're talking about, I don't want a whole lot of freedom of speech when it comes to that kind of crap. That's not, no fair attacking people, no fair.
Well,
no
would
fair.
you be okay with when somebody does do that, then everybody else gets to pile on them and say, look, you're a jerk.
Yeah, I know, but if you have a whole culture that accepts that kind of thing,
Yeah. Usually that culture is providing the people the freedom of speech to say that sort of stuff.
That's right.
And then punishing the people who criticize.
That's right.
You know.
That's right.
I heard a really interesting argument, and someone was saying that the time for fraternities has long since passed. Because they were saying, like, there's movies like Animal House where that kind of like panty raid mentality was like glorified. And so why would you ever have a group of people that are designed to sort of just serve this specific, purpose?
Yeah.
And a
lot of the frats have been doing things for generations, like accumulating dossiers on how to pass this class and
for the hazing, the inherent violence.
There's a good argument there to be made that most frats really don't need to exist.
I think what troubles me, though, in light of what Vivi is saying and what we're talking about, is the idea that we just simply say, well, okay, so we're just going to do away with that altogether. Instead of finding a way to create a conscious community where maybe people are coming together and assembling in a group that's based on some specific tradition that they want to then kind of bring into the next, sort of the next, whatever, not even generation, but into the next phase. And if we just got rid of everything, then do we get rid of also honor societies? And should we eliminate fraternities that are based on business or achievement or international language?
To live with people you feel comfortable with.
Right.
That's something
right.
to say for that.
Exactly, because when we start to break down those kinds of community-based, safe, there's a feeling of safety there.
Yeah, but it's safety for the right reasons.
Well, and that's the question. I don't think we ask that question. I think we just say, well, we can't solve that, so we're just going to eliminate it.
So instead of like making differentiations within fraternities,
right? Or even just saying like
about fraternities, capital F, and then
let's just have a conversation about whether or not this is appropriate. Let's have a conversation about sort of like what the historical, issues of whether it's fraternities or racism or sexism or gender inequality or whatever. Here's where it was. Here's where we'd like to get. And the answer is not to just dismantle every single institution that has a tradition prior to now, but we find a way to bring it into a newer current way of thinking. We actually find the way to make Praesia the foundation for the way that we engage one another, instead of just saying, we're just going to get rid of that because that's too sensitive. We're going to clear it all. We're just,
It's hard to think about how we get more people, especially younger people, to become, you might say, good agents within the marketplace of ideas. Where, first of all, they're going to be robust enough that they don't take offense too easily and then like fly off the handle and start, just flaming people. Where they're more interested in things that matter more and less interested in things that matter less, and putting more of their time into that. It's hard to think about, but it is something we do have to think about, how we're going to get the next generation to be better that way.
Yeah.
Age 13.
There's not a very
What do you mean?
Oh.
I mean, that's where it happened.
Age 13, they have a very high
Middle school?
development of superego.
Well,
And
think
they're really
too.
interested in changing the world for the better.
Think about that, what you just wrote about in the Virtue Ethics Digest, right?
Yeah.
About the case in Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah.
Where, there was the young girl who has Down syndrome. She's a cheerleader, and I think it made national news at this point. And
It happened over a year ago.
it was her colleagues, right?
Yeah.
Because she's since gone on, and they've
Yeah.
renamed the gym. But, her colleagues stood up for her, and they didn't go into the stands and beat up the people, right?
They did walk off the court and confront the people who were making fun of her, who were in the stands.
Yeah. But they didn't enact violence. They didn't wait for them after the game and, beat them up.
One of the things that really came across when I was doing the research on that was that school and that community really has had a successful anti-bullying campaign, where it wasn't just the sort of like, here's the bullet points, don't do this, sort of, come down on them hard, but like some discussions about why bullying is wrong, how to stand up for it, or how to stand up against it.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm really,
Point, counterpoint.
I'm really misarticulating things tonight.
Did you mention about age 13? Can you speak about it a little bit?
Yeah.
Is that a group that have a certain
12,
rule
13, the kids at that period of time are really thinking very idealistically. Mm-hmm. And, they really are out to improve their parents for one.
Yeah.
Some college students are like that too.
No, by the time they get into high school, then they're, much more involved in the group. But at that early age, that's really such an important time.
Yeah. The reason I wanted to bring it up because when you ask that question about how do we get young people,
Yeah.
where do we get them? I think it's the answer comes from that niche, which is the family. You say age 13 is so early of age. That's where the brain forms. That's where the character comes to. Right. But even then, who is behind that age? Who is behind that child? It is the teacher. It is the parents, right? And where is their philosophy? Where is the moral behind them? Is it a guiding? Do they have a guiding line, or guidelines? Do they have a philosophy?
Sometimes it's a teacher, and sometimes it's the kid is very lucky to have good parents. It's really it's quite an or it can be some person in the community.
Yeah.
Who turns them.
They tend to be attracted to their friends' parents.
Yeah.
Kind of transfer back and forth. Oh, her dad
That's a
is
good
so
point,
cool,
yeah.
and that.
Yeah.
But I feel like there aren't enough good examples because so much of what's happening is kids are on social media or they're on or watching TV. Not that so much, but all the talk is so like hit and run. Like make a joke and take advantage by making a joke about somebody, just like all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it's just a bad example throughout for many, many hours of their lives.
There's an overabundance of sarcasm and kind of, like that gotcha thing that you're saying.
Smart alecky, one-liners, kids, not a lot of respect for just the sense of somebody being older.
It's interesting. I teach at Queens College, and my students are from all over the world, and there's not one majority of anybody. I mean, I can't say that it's all Chinese or it's, but it's 2 or 3 of this, 2 or 3 of that, and when we work on projects, we often. I had a class a couple of years ago where there were a lot of Chinese in the class, but they aren't all from the former, from mainland China.
Yeah.
They're from Taiwan. They're from Hong Kong. They're from all over the place. And I had a student who grew up here in Queens, and he proceeded to keep asking these Chinese gentlemen all these questions about the country, all the things, all the myths that had been fed by the media. And it ended up being a very interesting conversation, and I said, this is a fine conversation to have. But, and I told Gary and the other gentleman, I said, but when you get tired of answering all these questions, you got to let them know. But, because this guy will ask you questions forever. And it ended up that all these people started having these conversations about the myths that we had been fed through the media, like the one-child policy.
Yeah.
And the gentleman said, the further you got away from Beijing, the more the policy did not apply.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of, so it was really interesting. It was interesting for me because my mother grew up there before the revolution, when Mao Zedong came in. So it was really interesting because the kids started to ask all these questions about the myths that they had heard, and they seemed to be able to take the answers from people who were from there, but that had very different experiences, even within mainland China.
Yeah.
So it was but I think it also depends on the group that you have. If you have people from all over the world and who have different experiences, culturally, racially, ethnically, the conversation often does not devolve into name calling. There's kind of, and as long as it's on a level where people don't feel threatened if they say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I don't know, I found it a very interesting class because we learned so much about each other.
Sure.
I think that's part of why, and I'm sensitive to time, but I think that's part of why Greg and Abdou and I wanted to start this discussion series, because it was a conversation exactly about that we were talking about some of the things that just seem to be, things that people latch onto, whether it's their misconceptions about a culture or their opinions on a specific topic, and they are immovable, and they are not interested in engaging in dialogue, and they are not interested in reconsidering anything.
I don't think we get too many of them coming to this, though.
No, not here. No, I mean, that's part of why we're in this space. But
And it was interesting, the conversation continued week after week after week. We went through, like the ownership of cars, how the cars were made over there, that they were cheaper, and that if you really had an accident, it was pretty disastrous. But it was interesting. In some form or another, it just continued.
Yeah, sharing stories and sharing culture often become really powerful ways to break down those barriers. I think it's really important.
I mean, one of the reasons I came tonight was when the Charlie Hebdo incident happened.
Yeah.
I have to say that I felt, satire, I understand, is a French form. Well, their kind of satire can be really biting.
Oh, yeah.
But
we have thought of that
I
too.
felt that the person really, the publisher really crossed the line, and I wondered if, because he was from the elite part of French societies, he felt he could say those things in public, but not really understand what it was like to be the children of immigrants that came to that culture that had a colonial relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Because France considered Algeria part of France at one time. And it's a real problematic relationship. And you can goad people. I just felt like it was a public goading, not just of everybody, that they didn't seem to have any respect for. What I felt was really tragic was the people who got killed as a result of that. And but when I talked to friends, they were like, well, I can say anything I want. I said, yeah, but there are consequences.
I think that's
There's a lot of zones where people are used to being able to say anything they want, and then if you go into another place, like, the sort of things that they were sort of routinely saying, if they were to go into a French suburb, one of the banlieues, probably that wouldn't have worked. Just like if you're going to tell racist jokes and you're going to do it, I don't know, say on
Ferguson,
the west side of Chicago, you're probably not doing, you're probably doing something,
we were evoking a different response. Yeah. I think what we'll probably do is come back to that point, actually, because the notion of satire is the foundation for one of Abdou's questions, and I'm just sensitive to time again. I'm going to just ask Abdou to pick up where we're leaving off right now.
Yeah, I think it's a good bridge, and I think Greg's presentation set really the tone on that he raised that this concept of marketplace, and I think that point that you brought up, maybe some of you came here because of Charlie Hebdo, and what was it really about? How far can freedom be tolerated, or the expression behind the freedom? How much can you say that can be tolerated? Is there limits? And I think the way the French define a satire may be different I don't know how much of you here read, those satiric papers like Onion.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, I see. I was not. I mean, until the Charlie Hebdo came, I spoke with a French citizen who told me that Charlie Hebdo is not a paper that is that make a light in France. It is because this outburst,
Yeah.
you refer to when you think of satiric paper, you think of Le Canard Enchaîné, like the restaurant down here. Le Canard Enchaîné is one of those big papers. Charlie Hebdo is, to me, and that's what he was telling me, Charlie Hebdo is very low in its moral and its way to just throw like amazing and very intolerable expression. It is a dirty paper, he told me. That if you care about moral, you cannot deal with that paper. It's about prostitution. It's like just against order. It's against order. And you say, wow, nobody wanted what happened that day. Nobody. Even if you hate that paper, but you cannot tolerate what happened because people have, and I speak in a position of a Muslim, who lived that reality. I'm from a country that is Islamic. My country is called Mauritania, Republic Islamic. Somebody asked me, how many people can bring? I say, no, nobody. You cannot even think of being something else in Mauritania. It's like in Iran, maybe today's Iran, or maybe the Iran after Ayatollah. But to me, Charlie Hebdo, this is the 21st century. Even as a Muslim, the 21st century Muslim should go beyond the time of the Prophet. That what was, accepted at that time, what was tolerated at that time may not be tolerated today, or vice versa. We have moved from an age. Like the message of the Quran, people say, can you read the word love your enemy or something like that in the Quran? Does the Quran have any teaching about loving the other? So I tell them, well, compare the Quran to the Pentateuch, like the books of the Old Testament, and you will see more of rules. You will see nuggets of that message of love. If you look for it, you will see it actually even put in a way that is so beautifying. You will say, wow, actually Muhammad have taught about loving your enemy. There is a book or a surat, a chapter in the Quran called Yusuf, where the message is about loving your enemy, tolerating. It is the story of was Yusuf, the prophet called Yusuf, the children of Jacob, the one who was in prison. Joseph, right? Yeah. That chapter is about it, and it's teaching, and it's inviting, it's prompting the good Muslim to emulate that prophet called Yusuf. That he was jailed, and he had all the reason to hate and to look for vengeance against his peers, his parents. But he forgave them, he accepted them. And when they came and they say, we deserve to be punished and all that, he said, no. You put me on that well that day, thinking that I would die, but actually, because of that, I was able to come here and become a prime minister and to have this position and for you to be here today. So there was like a hand behind you that did that. So instead of blame, so the philosophy of love and forgiving, and they call it forbearance. They say it's beyond just tolerating and accepting, but it's actually loving your enemy. put in a different formula. So the Muslim of today has to reinterpret in order to, so that's why Charlie Hebdo, for me, I mean, the message, I'm not talking about that dirty side, dark side that you can dig into and know and say, oh, I'm not part of that. But the satire, what did that, one of the holder of the paper who survived, I think was interviewed. He said, we are a newspaper against religion as soon as they enter into the political and public realm. So you are not meant to identify yourself through a religion in any case, not in a secular state. And Charlie Hebdo is just, it is a tradition of making outrageous attacks. And that's why I had actually these papers. And some of them are in French. I have to read it for you. This is about the girls who were abducted by Boko Haram. Mm-hmm. They call them sexual slaves. They say, don't touch to our allocations, means our children's fund. It's like the prophet. Sans coup de fouet si vous n'êtes pas mort de rire. The prophet. You know the Sharia, Islamic, that says you will be, how do you call it, slashed 100 times. You say, yes,
whipped.
Whipped. Well, yeah. You say,
Our allocations.
Our welfare.
Yeah, welfare, right? Yeah, welfare. That word. You will be whipped 100 times if you cannot laugh. Charlie Hebdo become. I mean, it's sometimes we are so serious. If we put our robes, the priest, the imam, that we miss that part of life. It's all about laughter. Mm-hmm. So Charlie Hebdo, I think, wanted to give a new tone. He wanted to say everybody, and it's not about the Muslim. It's about the Pope. It's about this is the Prime Minister, not Prime Minister, the Justice Minister of France, the actual Justice Minister.
Yeah, they're kind of equal opportunity offenders.
Right.
That's something that got left out.
Exactly. They're saying to you, we need to laugh just sometime. That's what life is about. That guy say, kill me. But I will use my pen because that's all I have. That's my life. So if you want to kill me for that, then kill me. He said that just like a month before this tragedy happened. So he was putting a new dimension in that the sacred, the scripture. He was telling, let's step out a little bit. Let's have some fun. Like I think the Pope today is doing. I mean, he's being a revolutionary, right? And many people like it. They say, this is good. Gay, lesbian, all that. Come on the game. Let's dance. I thought I have that thing, but maybe I don't have it. It's right there. Small. So where I'm going on this? I think, that was the point that I was saying earlier, that how far can we go to be condemned, to deserve to be punished? When you arm, when you go to that dimension to arm, I think you go too far. But how can you, and I think it can never be justified, but how can you prevent it? How can you make the speech? How can you use freedom of speech and make, put respect on it, put responsibility on it to make it acceptable? How can you wrap it to the point that it is acceptable by the other, not as an insult, but as a way to cope? I think what they did was like, just take it, do what you want to with it, right? And I think that was your point. Charlie Hebdo was was very defiant. He said, that's who we are. I think they hated the morals, they hated religion, they hated, the sacred. But they didn't want to make it as a tool to say to the world, this is a world of freedom, where freedom is not just a freedom for the sake of freedom, it is a freedom for the sake of working together and enjoying something together, right? So I'm just putting that first aspect of my talk out there. I see it nodding, son. I don't know where you stand in this. Just to raise a conversation, because that's what it is about. It was not like a presentation where I have the wisdom of saying so much and you listen and you see it was bravo. No, this is about sharing.
But if they're so strong in what they say, if it's so terribly offensive, maybe they stop conversation because there'll be fear, there'll be so much offense that you can't really have a conversation. Maybe.
I think it certainly doesn't provoke a conversation with the people who are going to be offended. Like satire, the person who's the butt of it isn't going to say, oh yeah, you got me, let's have a nice heart-to-heart because of it. Usually because it is so transgressive, so unfair. It's aimed at an audience, they already know they're not going to get them. It's aimed at the other audience of, say, other French readers, who might take it in. But here's one of the questions I have for you about that. It doesn't seem to me like a lot of satire really contributes to much discussion. It just sort of like throws it out there and says, these people are a bunch of jerks. Look at what kind of jerks they are. Let's talk about that. But it doesn't get to the how do we move ahead? How do we do something better? It has a very, it's great for destructive force, and sometimes we do need to take down, walls and idols and things like that. But it doesn't seem to have any powerful constructive force to it.
No, but it can. I mean, Jonathan Swift's argument against the argument that babies should be eaten.
Yeah, the Irish babies.
Yeah. I think it's very powerful when you agree with what the satirist is saying. I think it can be very powerful.
Explain a little bit more.
I agree with Jon Stewart a lot of times, and he's being very satirical.
Sure, and one can easily agree with what's being taken down and say that's bad, that's hypocritical, that's screwed up, or something like that. But I don't see a lot of that leading to. Sometimes what's done is a straw man thing, where okay, because this is bad, we should move to here. But you could have made the argument for here without doing that. What I don't see satire doing in most cases, and I'm sure there probably are some cases that can be pointed to, is offering something constructive. Swift says, look, this policy is stupid, but he doesn't say, here's what would be a better policy. The ancient Greek comedies, they actually had a point where in Aristophanes' plays and other plays, where the actors would take off the masks, and they'd come out into the audience and say, you on that appropriations measure last month, you were stupid, and then everyone would ha ha ha, look at that, they're going after that guy. But there wasn't any hey, we should move towards something. You can say, at least with comedy. Now I'm thinking of Aristophanes and the Lysistrata. It was a very funny play. It's sort of trying to promote harmony between the different Greeks, and they do it because the women decide we're tired of these men screwing things up. We're going to hold out and not give them any sex until they make a truce between Athens and Sparta. There's something at least productive coming out of it. But that's one of the few examples I can think of. I don't see something like this leading to somebody saying, oh yeah, we really need to rethink our attitude towards Boko Haram or any of that. It's just, look at those stupid people, you know?
Sometimes the satire just nails it. So you,
Oh,
so
yeah.
you feel this huge sense of relief. I mean, I get that from The Onion. It's like, oh, it's so right. It just said it exactly how it needs to be said.
Yeah.
And then, I don't
It
know,
is.
you can move on or whatever.
It is revealing things, you know, over and over again.
Yeah.
That's what Stewart does. He sees the thing in such a way that you see, oh, of course, that's just absolutely asinine.
Yeah.
Well, the
But
question
isn't it-
here, I think, is when it becomes offensive, and how do you act that it won't go to the point where harm?
I don't think we
Just
have
like,
a clear enough understanding of satire. I mean, the very fact that now on Facebook is a prime example, they actually say satirical or satire. There's this big
They do?
argument about it. Yeah, The Onion now actually identifies itself as satire. And we weren't having that conversation, you know, was it 7 years ago when there was that Onion piece and it said that the Senate threatens to shut down if Congress doesn't get a retractable dome? And it ended up in a Beijing paper, right, as a real
Oh, that's
news
right,
story.
yeah.
And we, you know, now though we're at this point where we're dumbing it down so much
Yeah.
that it's saying satire. And what's funny, I think, or not funny, but what I find really interesting is that oftentimes when people read something, and if it's in The Onion or even College Humor or some of these other like visual sites where it's a video satire, the response is, oh, how that's awful, right? Like you're kind of laughing, you're admitting that it's terrible. It doesn't actually further any discussion. It's
Right.
not like I'm going to say, wow, that prompts me to talk about excessive spending and, you know, maybe that connects to sports in some way and let's have a dialogue about that. You're right, you kind of get it on a visceral level or you don't and then you move on, but it certainly isn't something that you use as a conversation piece.
I can think of a good example. You know, obviously the satire that you agree with is fine.
Right.
But you know, remember the New Yorker cover where the Obama couple were, you know, what were they presented as, you know, high five?
They're given a fist bump.
Yeah.
Yeah, a fist bump and all of that.
Like terrorists.
So they were dressed up as terrorists.
Yeah, they were dressed up as terrorists.
Yeah.
And I was devastated by that. I thought it was just awful because I've taught at Queens College and I know that a lot of people don't get irony.
Yeah.
They
Right.
just don't get it. They take it literally. They don't know what irony is all about.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you see a cover like that and you think that people are going to take this literally, you know, it's.
I mean, how much do we have to expect that people who are being targeted should see things as ironic, even if they do have a good sense of it? I mean, if I choose to pick on somebody for something, it doesn't seem fair that then afterwards I get to say, well, it's on you to have a good, well-developed sense of irony and not to take it to heart or anything like that. Because I'm really the person who's choosing to put that forth. And we could say that some people are too touchy, you know, about some things. You know, there's all sorts of people who.
And there are times when subjects are not good.
Yeah, that's
You know,
true
I
too.
mean,
Yeah.
Really, you can't start making fun of Kennedy just after he's been shot.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you just
Right.
have to have a sense of the mood of what the country you're in or the people you're with.
But maybe that's one of the problems with having so much and such immediate media.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is you know, some of the great minds were having discussions with like minds and came to some understanding, and then slowly that may be filtered out in the form of songs, limericks, and
Sure.
things like that, until slowly people who needed to be educated about it began to be educated. But this way, it just goes out, and it's everywhere.
The proliferation is not only immediate but widespread, like you're saying, and
Yeah.
you know, and it's so easy for something. I mean, it just reminds me of those funny quotes that you see where it's like, you know, beware of everything you read on the internet, Abraham Lincoln, or you know, or Plato, or something like that, right? And it's assigned to somebody where you know, but And that's funny. But what if it were something that was wholly damning? You know, like Greg Sadler says X at Kingston Library, and it's a picture of you, and you know, you have those gestures you do a lot. Like Greg Sadler says he's the new Messiah, and your hands like happen to be up like this, you know, and then all of a sudden there's all of these groups that are, you know, denouncing you for making claims. You can't, once that starts and it's rolling, you can't pull it back.
Yeah. And I think it's important to have that in the background of these events like Ferguson or Charlie Hebdo. Charlie Hebdo is a very particular kind of theme, and it is, you know, you read that background of the Algerians in France. You raise the issue of 9/11. It's not too far yet. Wounds didn't yet close.
Yeah.
Right. What happened after that tragic event?
Well, you know, I went to a performance that actually made fun of that day about a year after, or for 6 months after, and it was actually very funny about people's reactions that day.
Yeah.
You know, what they thought was going on. This is before, you know, they started to be filled in with everything else. And the person I worked for at the Jewish Museum, at the time I worked in the museum world, they were, he was really offended. Really offended that I would go to a performance. I said, well, you know, there were things, I mean, people ran away from that. Those buildings collapsed, and people thought all kinds of things, how those buildings were going to collapse. Also, you know, people's, you know, they were running in high heels. They just threw the heels off. I mean, there were just lots of things that happened that you could laugh at afterwards, that you found yourself in such a ridiculous situation, even though there was tragedy coming all around you.
I think that
tragedy, they say humor is tragedy plus time, right? Like that's the magic equation for any comedy.
Well,
any comedy
or tragedy that happens to somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, either or.
I think with 9/11, it became part of American civil religion, you know, and it took on the kind of grandeur and aura that other things in American civil religion had as well. You know, like the veneration of the Kennedys, you know, for example, or what else? You know, I mean, Lincoln was viewed as like this savior figure, you know, who gave his life for the nation, all that sort of stuff.
But Giuliani was made fun of because of his possession of 9/11.
Yeah, eventually he was, but not at the start. At first,
no,
he was
even at the start in New York.
Oh, really?
The first episode of Saturday Night Live that came back on, and he was there.
Yeah.
And then Lorne Michaels made the comment, "Can we be funny?" It's like, why start now? That Tina Fey had a whole thing on Rudy the Rock. And I remember this, and she said it's going to be a 2-hour movie, and you're going to hate him until the last 45 minutes when he comes in and saves the day. Because there was this perception, nobody liked Giuliani until he suddenly was on everybody's
America's
TV
man.
reassuring, America, that everything was going to be fine.
But now he's, you know, he's made fun of because he keeps bringing it up that he was the savior of that.
Well,
Hardly.
But to go back to it, so there is still for a lot of people this kind of, you know, semi-religious aura to it. And I think that civil religion, in some respects, and different countries have different civil religions. You know, like Napoleon's tomb is part of the French civil religion. You go there and it's something. But you know, civil religion can sometimes be even more, in some ways, intolerant than like religion, where people have to live it out. And I mean, you know, if you go to a monastery, monks joke around, you know, even the ones who like, you know, the Trappist who involves the silence, they have humor.
Well, nuns tell jokes too. I mean, it's like
no, only monks.
No, I was in a nunnery in Guatemala, and I couldn't believe it. You know, I felt like I had joined like a sailor's crew. I mean, I was like, all of my Catholic schoolgirl upbringing was shattered. I was like, sister, oh my God, you're funny. You know, but
people who live within a framework of religion. You know, if the religion is in some ways, we could say, humanizing, it has to take in all of the human condition.
Yeah.
civil religion can just be a matter of the state, and so people can invest all the stuff that they don't put into religion into that, and it can really get I don't know, it can be very, very intolerant in its effects.
One
like
thing
the safety that the fraternity guys felt on a bus with the fraternity
Right.
brothers. I mean,
Yeah.
I've had conversations with friends of mine that would probably be really offensive to some people. I mean, there are certain safe places where you can say kind of whatever you want, a kind of a safe place. So at some point they cross the line.
Yeah.
And they crossed the line in history because we're no longer
Stuff that they did would have been okay
upsetting
like 40 years ago.
like the sexist talk, the
Yeah,
way
yeah.
women are treated. I mean, it was partly timing in
Perhaps.
history.
But also these, if you've visited people who are doing the church's work
Yeah.
out in the field, they're often, make fun of themselves more than
Sure.
they do other
Of
people.
course.
I mean, they find themselves in these absurd situations and trying to impose their Western values, or their thinking is Western versus what's really going on in the setting. And they make fun of themselves all the time.
Because they're living it as part of their life. It's not
Yeah,
an artifice.
exactly.
It's not something else that's kind of held out there.
And in some situations, the political situations in the countries that they're working in are pretty horrible.
Yeah.
It's kind of a safety valve.
Humor.
Whereas I never
Yeah.
got that effect with satire, especially when you look at Daumier's. That's where he makes those drawings of these monsters. I mean, they were real people, but he makes them into monsters.
Yeah.
But of course, I'm looking at it from, 100 years after something like that was done. It's satire. It's a different form of satire, or it's a.
That's how we perceive it, I think, depends on maybe two things. And one is the person who owns it, and the other is the target. Because, I mean, the Inferno and all of that is, you could look at Dante as a satirist.
Yeah, would you like to be one of the people who was alive?
Those people,
Whose name
Bordocchio and all these people, he's like,
Yeah.
having all of that. I mean, it's whether it's high art or low art. I mean, from what Abdou was saying, your conversation with your friend who said, oh, that's, it's a dirty magazine, it still shouldn't have happened. But I was thinking of, Mad Magazine or National Lampoon or
Onion.
all of these, things that we have as part of our culture where you just kind of, you go after everybody and anybody, but you
South
do,
Park.
yeah, I mean, with a light hand,
Right, with the light hand.
with the light hand. And when it becomes heavy-handed and then the reaction is a violent reaction,
Yeah.
that's when all of a sudden it's like, well, that was just too far. Whereas I think we could probably find several instances where similar cartoons, political cartoons, had been, made, or even a sketch on a sketch show like Saturday Night Live or
Right.
something like that.
Yeah.
Tina Fey and Amy Poehler being booed for making the Cosby joke that they made. It was like the one thing, they said so many things that night that really were quite, biting.
Yeah.
And that was the one thing that, you weren't supposed to cross that line. And so people were kind of
At least
shocked and admonished at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, look, they're,
Yeah.
But you can't distinguish between jokes about things that a person can't help, for example, the color of their skin or
Yeah.
the fact that they're female,
Hmm.
and jokes about, the Republican assholes, Really.
Behavior.
Yeah,
I'm an equal opportunity
Yeah,
politico,
me too.
so
I'm equally disillusioned.
there's
by
assholes on
left
either
and right.
side. And
Listen,
in between.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, people's
it's a good
behavior seems to me is
More fair game.
Yeah, that's fair game, but big ears or whatever it is, fat people, no
Yeah.
fair.
Well, it's like
Yeah.
religion too. I mean, religion is a personal.
It is and it isn't.
It is and it isn't.
I mean,
It's almost-
if you grow up within a particular culture where, even the notion of being an individual, that's a very Western
Absolutely.
notion in some respects, and more in some Western countries than in others. I don't know, when it gets to religious affiliations, I see that as something a bit different than political affiliations, you know.
But the
I
religion
wanted
has gone
to-
into the political so heavily.
Oh, sure.
What always existed there.
Yeah.
Winding down to the conclusion about what can we do about it, or what our governments are doing about it. I was just referring back to 9/11 and what happened after. What are the steps that the government, American government especially, took from that day, not only going to war, but after the war. After the war, what happened after the war? Guantanamo.
Yeah.
Well, they're still at war. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
think we're
Guantanamo.
Really
No, I
Yeah,
mean,
but
just
but
to-
but Guantanamo was a source. It's like it was feeding the recruitment of these agents.
Sure.
It's considered as the most effective way to recruit the jihadis.
Yeah, it's horrible.
It's horrible,
Yeah.
and the government was more like proud about it. You start talking about civil religion,
Yeah.
like this is our champion. Just remember President Bush standing on the USS
Yes, that's right.
and saying "Mission accompli,"
Yeah.
right? We done it.
Yeah.
What is the other world for thinking? So what has been going on between these two dynamics, the Western world and the Islamic world? It's something that is it is like a fire burning. Recently, it's like I think last month, the lady, the Minister of Justice from France, was talking here in the United Nations, talking about what is it that actually we must do. I just want to read one section here. He said that terrorism is not elsewhere; it's everywhere. It spreads in fragmented societies where the economic and the social fabric is being destroyed by poverty. People feel excluded. People who are going through a difficult moment in life and don't feel that anybody's else concerned about them, that they are marginalized, that they don't belong to society. So he says the government is taking those steps, and she was inviting the Western world that we can do something about it.
Well, there was a study of the drones.
Oh.
That every time they, when the drones went after a so-called big leader, more of our people were killed.
Yeah.
So war makes war. Every time you create war, you're creating a whole group of people who are going to react to you in a warlike way. So I think we gave away the whole thing when we created a war on terror. I mean, that's
right.
forever.
I mean, the war in terror is like it took the wrong way.
Yeah.
It is a war in terror, but how do you do that war? It is a war against poverty. It is a war against the weak who need to be uplifted, who need to be educated,
Sure.
who need to have their schools built and health care be taken care of, their children embraced, right?
Yeah.
Those are the basic of the Christian teachings. You know?
So
But I think
this-
those basics were like lost, right? When we talk about the children, when we talk about the 13 years, we talk about what is the philosophy behind their life. What are the parents are feeding them? I think something has been loose in the American or the Western world, those traditional values, not maybe belonging to the religious, how do you call it, heritage,
yeah.
but at least the moral values.
So the humor can expose and educate and clarify, even if it's satirical. But if it is strictly attacking, then what? It's
Right.
not like a war.
Yeah, that's what he was saying. That
Fighting
what is
war.
it that it is offering, right? Correct. That's what he was saying. What is it that the satire is offering
Yeah.
Isn't that what's-
beyond just that dimension of making
That-
fun and laughing?
But also, isn't it brings up points, educates, reveals the hidden blah blah blah. As
Yeah, I mean,
opposed to
it can
attacking
it can serve that function of clearing things away, you know, exposing hypocrisy. You would have to work in conjunction with something else. It's sort of like, you know, when you're talking about the drones. Yeah, they're great for blowing places up, but they don't do a hell of a lot more than that. And then if that's all you do, then you just alienate people even more, and you know, harden their attitudes, and tell them, hey, you're a jerk, so treat you like a jerk. You know.
So we'll get our own drones.
Yeah, and you know we're going to make fun of. We're being made fun of, so we're going to make fun of. That doesn't really help much either. You know.
It becomes an unwinnable situation. I mean, it's sort of like those old, you know, the Hatfields and McCoys, like whoever struck first will never know kind of thing, right? And it becomes mythologized, and there is no sort of easy solution, and there's no intelligent conversation. There's just a lot of barbed comments, you know, sort of like you were saying about the politicians. It's not to actually have a dialogue, it's to get the talking points out there loudly and as many times as possible, because that's what we'll remember.
Yeah, I mean, present political discourse is not going to be... Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's not discourse, it's not discussion back and forth. But it's not going to elevate us beyond what Charlie Hebdo is doing either, for the most part. I mean, they are concerned with, like, bigger things. They're not just, like, trying to make points. But it's not as if the Republicans and Democrats actually talk to each other in any serious way.
They play golf, but they don't.
Well,
Not together though.
The golf is the...
No, they do play golf.
Golf is a great game for that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. You look at the greens.
There was an interview on NPR this morning with a Syrian photographer, and he was describing the battlefield over there and how he said there are more Europeans than Americans that have come over here to fight, and that it really is not about. I mean, the Syrians who are left just trying to survive.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was pretty telling about who is really doing the fighting and who has really co-opted the war that's going on in Syria. It's pretty frightening. And no one's talking about it.
Well, I mean, there's discussion about how many Europeans and Americans, when they've managed to get out, joined ISIS.
Yeah, well, that's what these people are doing. They're fighting with ISIS against.
Yeah.
But how he said you can watch it play itself out. These people getting all their anger and aggression and into this what would you call it? It's a battlefield, but it's also this theater.
Yeah.
Well, that energy has to go somewhere, and it's not in any way to connect to kind of what you were saying about the, the fact that we've become so politically correct that we can't even have an argument. But it's, I mean, imagine taking, some sort of volatile powder keg, and you just keep pressurizing it and pressurizing it and pressurizing it, put more and more layers on top of it. Sometimes it's good to have minor explosions so we don't have large explosions. And if an argument in language can take the place of a violent action or an act of war, then obviously, we could solve some of these problems by getting loud. Much better to be loud and to shout at one another than to shoot at one another. But we're not creating a kind of culture or kind of, like you're saying, there is no discourse in the discourse. We're not creating a kind of environment where those conversations can be had intelligently.
And also the sort of release the pressure views on anger and rage turned out not to be, not to be very helpful, because when people indulge in their rage, there was this old like hydraulic metaphor of you just got to let the pressure out. But it turns out that no, anger is much more a matter of what you do, and it becomes a habit. It becomes a and the attitude that you take, and it becomes a tool for things. And so the more that you do that sort of thing, there's two things that happen because of it. One is it makes it easier for you to like turn to anger as the characteristic response next time around. But if you're doing stuff out of your anger that somebody else looks at and they're like, man, that person's a jerk, you know, now they get angry too, and now they want to retaliate as well. So I'm not very sanguine about the prospect of just letting off the escape valve.
I think I'm thinking more about being, and in other talks that you've given too about like the nature of right anger,
Yeah.
and not to minimize it to just letting go and just sort of venting, but the idea of being angry for the right reason, to the right degree, under the right circumstances. There are injustices, and we should be angry about them, and we should be rallying for justice.
Right.
But to have that dialogue and to be able to say this is not right, is one thing. Very different from saying, well, kind of what we were saying at the very beginning in almost a joking way.
Yeah.
Nobody can get loud, no, everybody keep it kind of together. This is some really hot topics, but we're just going to talk very smoothly. I mean, that's not any healthier either.
No.
But given the two extremes, obviously, better to shout than something else.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
where I think the point is, how can we get angry without losing ourselves?
Yeah.
How can we sit on the foundation, the very foundation that made this nation the most powerful nation of the world? I think we should revisit those values so that we can. But I don't think that anyone in this world is ready. I mean, there is no answer yet to. We're not winning this battle, right? Against this beast. But there is something I think that we are missing, and there is something that exists, and I don't think that it's somewhere else than here.